Welcome to Plato's Pod, where we engage in group discussions on selections from the complete works of Plato, the philosopher and geometer who wrote nearly 2,400 years ago. Today is September 26, 2021, and I am your host, James Myers. I am so glad to have here today participants from the Toronto Philosophy and Calgary Philosophy Meetup groups. And whether you have been with us before or are joining us for the first time, whether you have experience with Plato's works or are new to them, all are encouraged to add your voice to our dialogue. I will begin the discussion by introducing one of the key themes from today's reading selection, and will invite participants to exchange ideas as they wish. I'll provide brief summaries of the ideas and try to connect them for further consideration. So I've suggested a total of 3 themes for discussion, which I posted in notes on the shared drive, but we can go in any direction the group chooses. I would ask participants to use the raise hands feature in Zoom, and I will call on you by first name as it appears in your screen profile to speak in the order that hands are raised, giving preference to those who haven't spoken before. After we finish recording in about 2 hours, I would invite any participants who wish to remain online to stay and participate in Plato's Cafe, a casual half-hour discussion on Plato or philosophy in general. So today I'm especially pleased to launch Season 2 of Plato's Pod with our first reading from the Republic, a long dialogue that is among the most celebrated and in places perhaps the most controversial of Plato's works. We will be discussing in the next 2 hours the passages from Stephanus reference number 502d to 521b. These passages include Plato's famous allegory of the cave, simile of the sun, divided line of knowledge, and the nature of good. The selection chosen for today's reading is near the middle of the Republic and can be understood on its own without reference to the preceding sections of the dialogue. I chose it for today's discussion in part because of its relation to the dialogue Theaetetus, with which we ended Season 1 in June, as well as to Timaeus, with which we began our first season. We might also see references to Meno, Phaedrus, Charmides, and the other dialogues we discussed last season. So just a note here about our next meeting. Normally our meetings would be every 2 weeks, but because our next meeting would fall on a long weekend holiday here in Canada, I think we'll do our next meeting in 3 weeks. And I will suggest that we look at the passages in the Republic from 368a to 376c. So we'll go back in the Republic to an earlier sections of that work. So I thought we might start today's discussion with a reading beginning at 514a, which is the Allegory of the Cave. So as we listen to this, let's reflect on the question that Socrates raised in Theaetetus about the claim of Protagoras that, quote, man is the measure of all things, of the things that they are, and of the things that are not, that they are not. So imagine yourself as the prisoner in the cave, and whether you would be able to distinguish between that which truly is and that which truly is not. Would you be able to provide an accurate measurement and reflection of each state of being and non-being? Just by way of a little bit of background, in this part of the dialogue, Socrates and Glaucon have been discussing the education of the guardian class who will protect the constitution of the city-state that they have imagined. The guardians, they have determined, would necessarily be a rare breed of individual, possessing all of the 4 virtues and being free of temptation and desires that befall the rest of us. The guardians, they have determined, would require careful education on knowledge, and in particular knowledge of the good, which we will discuss after this scene. So let's go now into the cave, imagining ourselves, or the guardians, as the prisoner looking at the images on the wall. And so here I'll share my screen and we'll ask if someone would help to read this. We've got 2 roles in this. We've got the role of let me just flip to the section here. We've got the role of Socrates, which is the S, and we've got the
Glaucon.
And we've got the role of Glaucon. So was that you, Moshe, volunteering for Glaucon?
Yes, it was.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you. Do we have a volunteer for Socrates? I can read Socrates if nobody else would like. All right. Well, why don't I read Socrates and Moshe will read Glaucon. So this starts at 514a. And Socrates starts by saying, next, I said, compare the effect of education and of the lack of it on our nature to an experience like this. Imagine human beings living in an underground cave-like dwelling with an entrance a long way up, which is both open to the light and as wide as the cave itself. They've been there since childhood, fixed in the same place, with the necks and legs fettered, able to see only in front of them because their bonds prevent them from turning their heads around. Light is provided by a fire burning far above and behind them. Also behind them, but on higher ground, there is a path stretching between them and the fire. Imagine that along this path, a low wall has been built, like a screen in front of puppeteers above which they show their puppets.
I'm imagining it.
Then also imagine that there are people along the wall, carrying all kinds of artifacts that project above it, statues of people and other animals made out of stone, wood, and every material. And, as you'd expect, some of the carriers are talking and some are silent.
It is a strange image you're describing, and strange prisoners.
They're like us. Do you suppose, first of all, that these prisoners see anything of themselves and one another besides the shadows that the fire casts on the wall in front of them?
How could they, if they have to keep their heads motionless throughout life?
What about the things being carried along the wall? Isn't the same true of them?
Of course,
And if they could talk to one another, don't you think they'd suppose that the names they used applied to the things that they see passing before them?
they would have to.
And what if their prison also had an echo from the wall facing them? Don't you think that they'd believe the shadows passing in front of them were talking whenever one of the carriers passing along the wall was doing so?
I certainly do.
Then the prisoners would in every way believe that the truth is nothing other than the shadows of those artifacts.
They must surely believe that.
Consider then what being released from their bonds and cured of their ignorance would naturally be like if something like this came to pass. When one of them was freed and suddenly compelled to stand up, turn his head, walk, and look up toward the light, he'd be pained and dazzled and unable to see the things whose shadows he'd seen before. What do you think he'd say if we told him that what he'd seen before was inconsequential, but that now, because he is a bit closer to the things that are and is turned toward things that are more, he sees more correctly? Or, to put it another way, if we pointed to each of the things passing by and asked him what each of them is and compelled him to answer, don't you think he'd be at a loss and that he'd believe that the things he saw earlier were truer than the ones he was now being shown?
Much truer.
And if someone compelled him to look at the light itself, wouldn't his eyes hurt? And wouldn't he turn around and flee towards the things he's able to see? Believe that they're really clearer than the ones he's being shown?
He would.
And if someone dragged him away from there by force, up the rough, steep path, and didn't let him go until he had dragged him into the sunlight, wouldn't he be pained and irritated at being treated that way? And when he came into the light, with the sun filling his eyes, wouldn't he be unable to see a single one of the things now said to be true?
He would be unable to see them, at least at first.
Well, thank you for this. I think we'll end that reading at that particular part. And I just wanted to get the reaction of the participants here to what we've just read. This idea, if you've been able to imagine yourself as this prisoner in the cave, what do you imagine you would be thinking or seeing, either if you're staring at those images on the wall, or if you had been dragged away from that wall and shown something different? How would you react? And do you think there's any connection of this allegory to our experience in real life? I mean, Socrates says at one point, they're like us, the prisoner. Just wondering what anybody thinks about this. JK, your thoughts?
Yeah. Well, it'd be like someone raised, in a small town, right? Without the influence of other, other cultures, and they only spoke one language, and they only had, and all the institutions, all the things in the town were using the same language and symbolism, and that's all they would know. And if anyone would venture out of that small town into larger city, like, they would, feel strange and say, well, what is this all about, right? Until they lived there for a while and got used to the new language and maybe adopted some of the, some of the, symbolism, right, of that city. Otherwise they would probably feel, like, at first they would feel like an alien, right? But they would get used to it, yeah. So they would, yeah. So I that seems to be like a good analogy, because I myself, you know, lived for a number of years in a small town. Actually, I traveled. I came from a foreign country and lived in a small town, and so I had these, yeah, more than one experience of that feeling of being strange, and had to learn the new language, and a number of times. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. That's a very interesting analogy, actually, to being in a small town. It actually strikes me as being relevant too, because I too lived in a small town. I grew up in a small town, and what you said, JK, about symbols and understanding the symbols, whether they are images on a wall or words that are used to describe those. I think that's something that a theme that Plato um, investigated, in particular in the Phaedrus, which we discussed in season 1. How do we describe things, and do we share the same understanding of those descriptions? So this idea of being like that prisoner in the wall, in the cave, staring at the wall. How do we understand the meaning of those symbols, those images that are before us on that wall? Anybody else? Nuri?
I think Eva had her hand up first. Did she want to go?
Okay. Eva, if you'd like to speak first, and then Nuri.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Nari. So you're so kind. For some reason, I can't find the raise hand button, so I was actually raising my real hand. I would like to share, I had maybe the opposite perspective of living in a big town. I was born and raised in Istanbul, and I went to Europe around when I was like a teenager, and I was part of different ethnic groups in Istanbul. So as much as I could do, I knew that there were different lifestyles and there were different languages and all that. So it seemed like I was out of the cave in an early age. However, actually, I was really out of the cage when I moved to Indiana and started living in a small town where everybody knows each other and everybody knows me. So I think it's the perspective that you are currently and how you see people around you, because you might be fooling yourself with the happiness, or that dopamine hormone while you're watching those shadows too. So I'm wondering if it's about the way that we see things, on the change, on the shift of in or out of the cave. And thank you again, Mary. You're so kind.
Oh, my pleasure.
And thank you for raising that point of perspective, Eva. I think that's a very key aspect of this that we can explore. So, Nuri, your thoughts?
So like most of you, I grew up in a small island, and everybody knew each other. My parents were very, protective. We didn't really get an opportunity to mix a lot with people. And then we migrated. And so I kind of grew up in this new environment, new country. And I really feel like living here most of my life than I did on my island, that the environment really changed you. And that's because I continue living. So if I go back to the island, I can't really relate a lot to the people there, because it's so different. And being in a cave, it all depends. If you come out and you see new things, you might be tempted to, depends on the time. If it's a day, you will want to go back to your cave. But if you're forced to live in the new environment, to see the same things over and over on a daily basis, I think it will change you, whether you do it for a week, and it all has to do with timing. I feel it has to do with timing and the duration that you spend in a new environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Nuri. And that idea that you just mentioned of adapting to the new environment, I think is quite an interesting one, because of what Plato describes next in that section that we didn't, the part that we didn't read next in that section, where the prisoner comes out of the cave. The part that we read says that he was very confused about what he saw and questioning whether what he saw was reality or not. But then Plato goes on to talk about how the prisoner is actually then, once he becomes accustomed to reality, which takes a while to adapt, as you said, Nuri, then is dragged back into the cave, doesn't in fact want to go back into that cave, because now he realizes that what he was seeing on the wall were just projected images and not reality. But he's forced to go back and to act, to play the role of philosopher, and to help to bring the others into this real sense of reality. And he says it's a very dangerous project, that the others might actually want to kill him. They might not want to adapt. They might not want to get away from what they think is their reality as they're sitting there staring at the images on the wall. So thank you for bringing that theme of adaptation over time. I think that was very helpful. Thank you. I have Moshe next. Moshe?
Could you repeat your original question for me, and then I might comment?
I think the original question was just sort of, how we would see ourselves in this context, whether we see any relevance of this particular analogy to our own existence.
Okay. The question that I was asking myself as I reread what we read was, how would we know the difference? How would we know that what we had seen before was, to use the terms here, inconsequential, and that what we're seeing now is more? How would we be able to make that distinction? We certainly could make the distinction that it's different. I was listening to NPR, National Public Radio, yesterday, and they had this, The Hidden Brain, I guess, was on. And they were talking about these experiments that had been done where people join a club or join a team, or they gain some sort of affiliation. And the affiliation could be quite arbitrary. Somebody says you're on team A, somebody says you're on team B, A, B. And the people quickly adapt to the values of that team without really knowing it. They can do it within a matter of minutes. And I'm thinking that in the 21st century, with the bombardment that we have of social media and the 24-hour news cycle and all sorts of different propaganda outlooks that we have, the people can flip from one to another and not even know the difference. They can't tell that one is false and one is true, or that one is more and that the other was what was the word here? Inconsequential. And so I think socially, I think we're very much in the same predicament today. And I think the question that we have to raise to this is, even though we drag this guy out of the cave, what sort of epistemic mechanism has to be put in place in order for him to know that what he's seeing now is more real, and that what he was seeing before was inconsequential or just a shadow?
Thank you for that very powerful statement. You use the word difference twice, I think, Moshe, and I think that's a critical observation there. That how do we know the difference between what some person says is real and what we are seeing ourselves. And then you also raise the question of how do we train somebody to understand the difference between those things. And it's a very important dilemma, I think, in this dialogue, in that, here are this guardian class of these, kind of almost superhumans that are being trained to understand these differences. Who's training them? Like, and do the trainers themselves have the knowledge to train on these differences? I just wanted to explain, actually, I've got this image on my screen behind me. It's actually a bit of an optical illusion. I'll just move my head over to this side here. And this, I came across this yesterday. It's called Adelson's checkerboard. It's a little optical illusion designed by a professor at MIT by the name of Adelson. And in this image, the tiles on this checkerboard, one is a dark tile or a dark background. It's labeled A, which is just at the kind of top left. And then the other is in the middle, it's labeled B, and it appears to be a lighter tile. And in fact, Adelson designed this checkerboard so that, in fact, apparently, although I don't see it, apparently the color of the tile B is actually the same as the color of the tile A. And this optical illusion happens because of the way our minds infer the way that light lands on this checkerboard. And so apparently, scientifically, they are exactly the same shade, tiles A and B in this checkerboard. So I just wanted to raise that because you had mentioned differences, Moshe, and this is an example of difference. And it's an example of maybe how the eyes can be deceived sometimes when we see things. And so, as you said, we need to train ourselves to understand the differences because we can't necessarily always perceive these differences with our eyes. So thank you again for that very powerful connection that you made. We'll go to Jose. Jose?
Yes, my interpretation, yes, it's the same that everybody said, but basically it's that the prisoners, they see the world according to the shadows. So they are the puppeteers in the back that move the shades, and this is the way that they see the world. And so basically, they have opinions. They don't have knowledge. And the prisoner that escape the cave, well, I think because he's talking about education, is when a person like us receive education and start getting to knowledge, not just opinions. And he gets out of the cave and he see the light, and he doesn't see now the shades, he see the real thing, and etc. This is my interpretation. Is the transition between being only by opinions and they see the world like according to others show you the world, and seeing the real thing.
That's an interesting statement, and actually touches on the passage. It's probably around 514c or so. And this is part that we read, where Socrates says, "Then the prisoners would in every way believe that the truth is nothing other than the shadows of those artifacts." And so, as you said, Jose, this is kind of this idea of transitioning from that belief or opinion into a realm of knowledge. And I think a very important part of what we'll continue to talk about today as we move into the simile of the sun is this idea of the difference between what Socrates describes as the visible realm, which is what we see with our eyes, and the intelligible realm, which is what we understand in our minds. And those are two different realms. And so, what we see, we need to then test that, our understanding of that, in the intelligible realm, which we can't see. And that's where Socrates starts to talk about the divided line, and in that testing process of, is what we see in fact believable? We'll go next to Joel.
Thank you. I'd just like to riff a little bit off of what J.K. was saying and give an example. So I have a background in accounting, and I made a trip to the Philippines. And in the Philippines, coming from what we parenthetically refer to as the first world, I felt rather superior that our systems and methods and procedures would be first world, and the Philippines is not quite first world. I discovered when I was there that they had a policy in all their restaurants that the seniors get a relief from their value added tax as long as the restaurant gives them a discount equivalent to the value added tax. So I was old enough that I qualified, and I was quite content to take advantage of that whenever I could. On reflection, and coming from what I felt was the first world, I thought, well, we have all the first world methods and ideas and policies and procedures. What could the Philippines have to teach us? On reflection, I see that the Philippines, apart from giving lip service to helping the seniors, they have embedded in their tax system a way to encourage seniors and others to take them out, socialize with them. It had a host of social benefits beyond just the numeric saving on my Big Mac or whatever the meal that I was having was. And this kind of took me out of my cave in a way, that procedures and ideas and ways of doing things that I have always been accustomed to and had, egotistically assumed were first world and first rate, might have much to learn from other parts of the world and other ways of thinking and doing it. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's my 2 cents for what it's worth.
Interesting connection you've made there, Joel. I think it strikes me as being actually particularly interesting for the next section that we're going to, or the section that we'll read in our next session, which, as I said earlier, is going to be 368A to 376C. And this assumption on which they have built this imagined city is based on the idea that each one of us has a single natural aptitude, one only, and so that somebody in this imagined city that Socrates and Glaucon have been imagining, and Adeimantus and other characters have been imagining, has only one role to fulfill in life. If you're kind of born a farmer, you will always be a farmer. If you're born a cobbler, you'll always be a cobbler. And so that kind of strikes me as, and I want to discuss that assumption the next time. I think it's a particularly important discussion that leads to some maybe misapprehensions about Plato's Republic. But maybe that's kind of this idea of the personal cave that you're talking about, that we just all live in one particular frame of reference or one particular perspective, as Eva was saying. And we need to break out of that. So that's I found that particularly a powerful idea. I wanted to raise here to a couple of things. I think it was Moshe who mentioned, the kind of powerful computer algorithms that are out there now, and people's, how people interpret them, whether they think those are reality or not. I think it was a number of years ago, I think they called them deep fakes, where there was an image, I think it was of President Obama saying something that he had never in fact said. And the computer algorithms were good enough to make the viewers think that the president had actually said something that he never in fact said. And so maybe that's a little bit of an analogy to the images on the wall, something that's not actually real. But I wanted to raise here as well something that I included in the Meetup notice posting, which was a link to Nick Bostrom's ancestor simulation hypothesis. And so Nick is a very well-known philosopher at Oxford University. And this hypothesis he posted, I think it was about almost 20 years ago now. And there's a link to it. What he's saying in this link is, how do we know that our own very existence right now is not a simulation? How do we know that we are not living in a simulation? How do we know that a future civilization with infinite computing power, how do we know that this future civilization has not generated a simulation of their ancestors and that we are the living images of that simulation? And I thought that was a particularly powerful connection to Plato's Allegory in the Cave. And I was wondering what everybody else thinks about that. As I think about it, I can think of, maybe 100,000 reasons why I am not an ancestor simulation of a future civilization. But can I think of infinite reasons why I'm not? Or are there some circumstances under which I might actually be that simulation that Nick Bostrom raised in his hypothesis? And so I was wondering what people think about that. If you had a chance to look at that, Nick Bostrom paper. It was a relatively short paper that was posted. And really, even if you just read the first paragraph of it, you'd kind of understand where he was going with that. But we live in this universe of uncertainty, and how do we know for sure, for absolute sure, we would stake our lives on it? How do we know that we are not that simulation? How do we know that we're not those images on the wall that Plato is talking about? If we update Plato's analogy, how do we know that? And if we update Plato's analogy, it's kind of a quaint analogy, like none of us, probably most of us, have not been in a cave. And even if we were in a cave, this idea of people with torches standing on the parapet projecting images on the wall, well, that's kind of quaint, and maybe that's the way it might have been 2,400 years ago when Plato wrote this. But maybe if we update that analogy and say, well, what he's really referring to with those men on the parapet with their torches is really kind of the source of everything that we see. And so whether that source is men on a parapet with torches, or really just the source of the energy that we now know converts itself into mass at the speed of light squared, do we really know the cause or the source of everything that we're seeing? Can we go all the way back to the original source of everything that we're seeing to really and truly understand it? So I see Nari, your hand is up. Nari, your thoughts?
Yes, James. So I just wanted a bit of clarification. I know philosophy is great. We get into depths and depths, but, I know you are real online, and everyone else, we're chatting. But this illusion that you're speaking about our ancestors, we historically have learned a lot, whether you could trace it back to our DNAs. And because if you put a child in a room and just leave the child there without any stimulation, what do you think that child would grow up? Just give it food and let it grow? Would they learn anything? Would they know anything? So I'm trying to understand, are you saying that we are an illusion of our ancestors, that what they've taught us? Just wanted some clarification.
Thanks. And it's not a proposition that I'm making. I'm just saying, maybe there's a slight, 0.0000 infinite number 0.1 chance that this is true. This was Nick Bostrom's hypothesis or proposition that he was making to say, how do you really know the source of everything that's here? And so, Nari, you mentioned, you said that I'm real because you're seeing me on the screen, but you're actually not seeing me on the screen. You're seeing pixels of me on the screen. And furthermore, we now know that the brain operates with a 1/10 of a second delay in everything that it sees, because it takes the brain, like it takes 1/10 of a second for the images from those pixels to go through your eyes, reach the visual cortex, and meaning to be fabricated. So we know this. This is how the brain works with this 1/10 of a second delay. So even though you're seeing the pixels of me on the screen, you're seeing the pixels of me on the screen as I was saying things 1/10 of a second ago. So you're not really seeing me, you're seeing an image of me. And, this is kind of modern neuroscience. This is something I learned from listening to David Eagleman's The Brain series that was done on PBS maybe half a dozen years ago. This kind of perception of things. And so, again, I mean, yes, if you were to travel to my home and see me sitting here, yes, you might think I'm real, but just to see me on the screen, how do you know I'm not one of those deep fakes like I was talking about that they did of the former president saying something that he didn't say? So it's an interesting question.
Yeah, but let's say, sorry, I know JK has his hand up, but just it's like, yeah. So if I see you drive by your home and you come out in your front yard and you would look the same as your image and you may not look like JK, then I know it was a fake, right? But your pixels are as similar to what you look like in person. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, you raise a very good, important point that I think we should discuss. I mean, it's at what point do we get absolute knowledge of who's real or what's real and what's not real? Or is it even possible to get absolute knowledge? We can certainly be very close to certain, I think, but is it possible to be absolutely certain? And that's what I'd like to explore. I mean, that's the kind of hypothesis that Nick Bostrom was raising. So thank you for raising that. It's a very good point. I mean, it strains credulity to think that what we're seeing is not real. But maybe we need to kind of test that always in our minds. So we'll go to JK and then to Moshe. JK?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And the reason why, as you're saying, like Nick Bostrom is saying, is that we don't really know. And if you dispute that kind of doubt, then you just look around, turn on TV and the news, and you see how many people disagree on what is the truth, what is the political truth. Even now, who is the real president, right? And you have all these conspiracy theories floating around, and you have so many religious disagreements, not just religious, but just common disagreements about what is real. And on the social media, there's all these different views that people subscribe to. And so that indicates that there is a, prevailing, common prevailing disagreement about what is real. And so that's why people like us gravitates toward philosophy, where the question is real about what is real. The question is there, and you can't deny that there is doubt about what is real. And even among philosophers, among scientists, disagree about what is real. And even all the scientists, as now are warning us about global warming. 99% of them are telling us that. But then there's massive numbers of people who disagree with the idea of global warming. Even with all the news about the forest fires and storms and so forth, and melting glaciers, rising oceans and so forth. People still deny that. And so, so that kind of, doubt, the prevailing doubt and disagreement among people indicates that we don't know what the absolute truth is.
Very interesting the way that you put that, JK. This idea of this potential disconnect between cause and effect. You use the example of climate change. So we can see the effect of whatever is happening is rising global temperatures. I mean, I think people, can measure. They've measured over history, and they see that we're something like 2 degrees above the historical norm or something. But then the cause of that, as you said, is something that's very much in dispute. I mean, a lot of scientists will say the cause is human activity, causing pollution and greenhouse gases and all of that. But a subsection of people will say that there are these trends in time, and these global warming events happen without human intervention. They just happen. And so that's what these people believe. And so we're left here with this, potential disconnect between belief and knowledge. And I think a very important theme in this section of our reading today is this whole connection between cause and effect. And that goes right back to one of the first Plato dialogue that I was exposed to was the Meno, in which Socrates says, all knowledge is recollection. And then he goes on to say that it's recollection of the account of the reasons why. And that's something I think we will touch on today in our discussion of the divided line. It's that account of the reasons why that we have to make in our minds that connects cause and effect. And maybe another way to say cause and effect is subject and object. And that's a particularly important thing as we get into the revolution that's about to happen with computing. So to take Nick Bostrom's hypothesis even further, he's talking about this advanced civilization in the future that has infinite computing power. Well, that's potentially something that we will get with quantum computing. And those who have been on this podcast before know that, quantum computing is a pastime of mine. In fact, yesterday I was on a quantum computing webinar talking about the challenges in quantum communication. So we're connecting with the quantum properties of the universe to entangle our knowledge in such a way that subject and object will be superimposed, so that subject and object will be simultaneously active. And so how will we distinguish between subject and object when we get into the quantum realm, which is what we're trying to do with quantum computing? So it's a very important situation in terms of understanding cause and effect and the connection between them and the order of those. So I thank you for raising that. I think you used a very good example with climate change there, JK. We'll go to Moshe. Moshe?
Well, we're really jumping right into the center of it, aren't we?
Indeed.
I just want to point out that the Greeks, starting from Thales, were materialists, and at the time of the writing of Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, the Greek mind did not distinguish between man and nature. The distinction between man and nature came years after that, and I think it's an artificial disjunction. Your example that you gave from Nick, who I have not read, sounds very much Cartesian, because this was this is the question that is raised in Descartes by the evil genius, and to put it in modern terms and to make everybody think that we're somebody else's ancestors and things like that is really just evil genius 2.0. Okay, but this distinction that Descartes made, I feel is illegitimate. If you remember, Gilbert Ryle in his concept of mind talks about, he wants to understand how we can have this mind-body differentiation, and how we can think of the mind as the ghost in the machine. And the ghost in the machine can be, manipulated by the evil genius, and it can be made to think that it's, some future civilization's ancestor. And Ryle points out, I think rightly, that people who hold this idea that there's the mind is the ghost in the machine and is not connected with it, are making what he calls a category mistake, which I'm going to refer to as a linguistic mistake or a mistake in meaning. And he gives the example of somebody coming to Cambridge and being shown the houses of the Dons and the libraries and the quad and where the students are. And he says, okay, well, I've seen the Don's house and I've seen, the administration's house and I've seen the students, but where's the university? And it's a category mistake because he doesn't realize that the university is just this collection and of objects and processes. And so Ryle is suggesting to us, and I take the suggestion rather warmly, that we're using the concept of knowledge inappropriately, okay? And this brings me to 2 points. One, it brings me to G.E. Moore's point when he was talking, when he was giving his defense of common sense. If you would try to tell me that I'm not really here, that I'm not really a person, or that I'm a simulation, you're denying common sense. And his proof is a little hokey that it is that I have my hands, 2 hands presumably, and if you were trying to do that, you'd really be trying to make me insane. You'd be trying to make me a question that would ask me a question that if I would take it seriously, I would go mad. Which brings me to the final point. We know a lot philosophically about knowledge, not conclusively, when we're talking about propositional knowledge. If I say, I know that P, I know that the grass is green. I know that the woman in the painting is wearing a hat. I know that because I have a belief, and I have evidence that justifies that belief. And there are problems with certainty, and then there's Gettier's, little queer thing where I think he equivocates. But generally, I mean that I have a justified true belief, and that's what we call knowledge. And I'm in the world. I know that I am real. If I know that you appear to me as a box and pixels and things like that, but I have no doubt that if I was walking down Yonge Street in Toronto and I bumped into you, there would be James just right there like that. Okay, and so I think that this is it is certainly a legitimate question to be raised. The question that you're raising. But I do think that our common use, that our public use of a common language makes it such that if we look at that language and how we use it, we can dissolve these problems and do a kind of therapy. That means that while philosophy is the most important discipline to me, and it has taken me years and years of studying and working on these puzzles to come to that statement that philosophy enables us to do mental therapy, enables us to be able to see that we're in the world and that we can have knowledge of the world.
Well, thank you, Moshe, for raising it. You've raised a number of very good and important points. I think, certainly the use of Descartes and, this, or the reference to Descartes and, perhaps his method of, doubt, taking all of the doubt out of the picture and leaving only himself as that which he cannot doubt, or his mind is that which he cannot doubt. But I think you raised some issues with that, and then certainly this idea of common sense, which you talked about. I think it's something that I think we can explore, and certainly the other idea that you talked about of justified true belief. You made the very interesting point about our agreement on the symbols and the language that we use to justify our belief. And I think that's a very important point that Plato was talking about in Phaedrus that we talked about in the first season. And that's something I'd like to explore. And certainly I think what you said really helps to lead us into that discussion on the divided line, which I think we'll get to in probably about a half an hour. Because I want to touch on that, but I think what you said really leads us into that discussion. How do we justify our beliefs? And Socrates gives us one particular way of justifying our beliefs with this divided line that he talks about in the readings that we've got today. So thank you for raising those very important points. I'm just wondering if anybody else has any thoughts on that particular passage that we started reading, the analogy of or the allegory of the cave. We have Nuri.
No, you just mentioned about Socrates, and he also said something about democracy, that people should, choose on their leaders on knowledge. And we get back to the point of science, and it's taught us a lot. Language, we all give grass a green color, so we all know what it signifies. It's green. And we can't discount science, that it has brought us forward a lot. So just don't want to get off topic, but that's my thoughts about Socrates and democracy and being a philosopher. He thinks we should hire, people, we should elect our leaders on their knowledge and not on, kind of beliefs.
Thank you, Nuri. You raised well, Socrates actually raises some objections about democracy as well as other political systems towards the end of the Republic, and we'll get to that later on in the season, I think. But certainly what you said, I think, bears some relationship to this allegory of the cave in terms of whether we believe in the images that we see before us. And I think the point that Socrates makes later about democracy is that because our beliefs can be subject to manipulation, I think, as Moshe was saying earlier, with the kind of algorithms that are going around the world today, sometimes can manipulate us, that people act on beliefs that are false and don't necessarily test those beliefs. So it's a key point and a key connection between what happens later in the Republic, this discussion of different political systems, including democracy, and this allegory of the cave and looking at shadows that we're talking about here today. So we'll go back to Moshe.
I just wanted to, you said what I was going to say. I just wanted to point out that Socrates was highly anti-democratic. He didn't like that idea at all.
Yeah, certainly. I think he advocates for the philosopher king, I think is the term that's most often used. And so this idea that only with philosophy can a leader properly lead, I think is the key. But it's a theme that I think we need to keep in mind for sure as we explore the Republic in a number of sessions this season. We'll go to JK.
Yeah, this kind of idea of why did he believe in a democracy? Because he understood that the public sphere, the social order, the symbolic order, can be manipulated, and depends on who's in control of that symbolic order, right? And so, yeah, everybody can share, and a common perception of what is real, but that common perception can be manipulated by within that symbolic order by people in power. And so every society has this kind of common understanding that everybody supposedly are supposed to share, and we have ours, even though we claim to be free. And so even in our so-called democratic society, people affirm their freedom to the point where it's being manipulated to their own disadvantage, to their own against their own interests. So you see it in this movement of groups of people who are even against wearing a mask, not just against vaccination, but against wearing a mask, even for their kids. So there's a kind of control there of that symbolic order, and so yeah, we all share the same symbolic order. Supposedly, we're supposed to understand what the truth is, right? What is real. But there's some quite a bit of disagreement about what is real, depending on who's in control of it and so forth, and manipulating it.
It's a very interesting use of the word, or the term symbolic order. Fascinated by the word order, actually, in that, and again, it takes me back to what you said before about climate change. So now you've used the connection between cause and effect of the COVID-19 pandemic that we're in now, and the example of masks. We know that masks prevent the transmission of COVID-19, and yet there are those who object to that, and so maybe that's similar to the climate change or the climate change denial example that you gave before. And again, this confusion between cause and effect or symbolic order, I think, is as you've now used. So it's a very interesting, that idea of ordering of what happens first and what happens second. And again, as I said earlier, that kind of knowledge being the account of the reasons why. And when we go back to figure out why something has happened, we have to go back and figure out all of the causes. That each cause has a cause itself, and what's the original cause of it all. So I think that's we've had some very good ideas here. It's I'm not advocating for Nick Bostrom's proposition. I'm not sure that he's advocating for it either. He just puts it out there as an idea that we might explore in terms of just really understanding, do we understand the cause of everything that we see in the world today? And so maybe this would be a good time to turn to one of the other themes in this dialogue, which is the simile of the sun. And let me just project this on the screen. Let me just go up to this. We'll do the simile of the sun, and then we can talk about the divided line, which is kind of Socrates' suggestion as to how we might distinguish between that which is real and that which isn't. So this is from 507b to 508a. In this section, and maybe I'll just read it here. Socrates says, "We say that there are many beautiful things and many good things, and so on for each kind. And in this way, we distinguish them in words. And beauty itself and good itself and all the things that we hereby set down as many, reversing ourselves, we set down according to a single form of each, believing that there is but one, and call it the being of each. And we say that the many beautiful things and the rest are visible but not intelligible, while the forms are intelligible but not visible. With what part of ourselves do we see visible things?" So here, just as before he's asked this question, Socrates has segregated between the visible and the intelligible. These are different realms. The intelligible is in the mind, the visible is in the eyes. And so then Glaucon responds with what part of ourselves do we see visible things is the question that Socrates has asked. And Glaucon replies with our sight. And Socrates goes on to say, "And so audible things are heard by hearing, and with our other senses we perceive all the other perceptible things. Have you considered how lavish the maker of our senses was in making the power to see and be seen? Well, consider it this way. Do hearing and sound need another kind of thing in order for the former to hear and the latter to be heard? A third thing in whose absence the one won't hear or the other be heard?" And then Glaucon says, "Well, no, they need nothing else." Socrates goes on to say, "And if there are any others that need such a thing, there can't be many of them. Can you think of one?" Glaucon says, "No, I can't." Socrates says, "Sight may be present in the eyes, and the one who has it may try to use it, and the colors may be present in things, but unless a third kind of thing is present, which is naturally adapted for this very purpose, that sight will see nothing, and the colors will remain unseen." Glaucon says, "What kind of thing do you mean?" Socrates says, "I mean what you call light." Glaucon says, "You're right." Socrates ends this little section by saying, then it isn't an insignificant kind of link that connects the sense of sight and the power to be seen. It is a more valuable link than any other linked things have got, if indeed light is something valuable. So I just wanted to raise this section here because I think the connection, first of all, to emphasize this difference that Socrates is making between the visible, which is what we kind of explored in that allegory of the cave, the visible images on the wall, and the intelligible. And this distinction of the intelligible in the mind and the visible is what the eyes say. In this interesting section, Socrates is saying, well, the sun actually gives us the power to see and to be seen. So it gives us a power that we can exercise ourselves, and it gives others the power to see us. And I think where I wanted to go with this is kind of, again, this object or this coincidence of subject and object, the coincidence of cause and effect. And he's saying here that the sun is kind of that third thing which connects or links the cause and the effect. And I'm just wondering what people think about this simile of the sun here. And he's using it as a simile because he's saying that, knowledge is like this. Knowledge, we have the power to know, and we have the power to receive knowledge and to know things. So let me just, I see we have a few hands up. We'll start with Moshe and then go to JK.
Thank you. This idea of the good raises a jillion questions. Going back to what can be known as opposed to what we can have opinion about, the forms are the things that the mind can directly apprehend, and they constitute, the true, the beautiful, and the just, and they're permanent and unchangeable. But now Plato, and let me just put that out on the shelf for a second. I want to go back to this, in order to eliminate that, I want to go back to this idea that you need to have light in order to be seen, and that no other thing has, no other thing except for sight has a medium like that that's required, a third thing. But if sound also has that kind of property, I cannot hear or be heard without some sort of gaseous medium, and in this case, air, being shared between us, because otherwise, my vocal cords, changing the, the amplitude and the frequency of the puffs of air that are coming out of my mouth would never be accessible to a hearer. But so I want to put that bad physics aside and go to the idea that now we need to have a medium, the idea of the good, in order to be able to, because the sun is going to turn out to be the idea of the good. I know I'm probably jumping ahead here. But that means that the things that are true, perfect, unchangeable, and real, the forms, are now, in principle, unknowable unless there is something else out there that causes us to know it. And that itself must be something that is without a cause, or else the idea of the good has to be something that is causeless, that causes everything else. Otherwise, there would be an infinite regress and we would never have any knowledge at all. So Plato has put us in a position where we have this causeless thing that causes the objects of our knowledge to be intelligible. And I take this as a problem, because the forms themselves were supposed to be the things that I could rely on, and now I can't even rely upon them.
Well, you've touched on a number of ideas. Certainly the good is something that we can look at actually in the next part of this reading, which I'll show on the screen momentarily. And so we can explore what Socrates says about the good. Certainly, you've raised the idea of the forms, and for those who haven't been with us before, the forms in Plato are kind of the ideas which are only sensible in the intelligible realm, not accessible to the five senses, but accessible only in the mind, which is beyond the five senses. So thank you for raising the forms. Certainly something that we'll go back to. The forms are kind of the changes. If I think back to my favorite part of Timaeus, 28a in Timaeus, the forms are that which are and never become, which is distinct from the realm of that which is always becoming but never is. So to keep that in mind, I think would be helpful. I think what he's saying here with the sun is that the sun kind of offers this two-way path. We know now that the light, or the what we call the photon, the so-called particle of light, is massless, and mass in physics is that which has resistance, and so the photon has no resistance. So the photon is this kind of massless, without resistance path that illuminates things in a way that I can see them, but people can also see me. And he's saying here also that colors we might, if it's dark, we won't see the difference in colors. But when there's light, we see the difference in colors. So I think what he's trying to say here is that we depend on this force to kind of provide us with this two-way path to comprehend things, and so that others can also comprehend us. I think that's what he's trying to say with the simile of the sun, but interested in what others think about this as well. So we'll go to JK.
Yeah, it's this distinction between the things that are that are perceived by the senses and the mind, the intelligible. Is he like forecasting the distinction made by Descartes years later about this about the mind distinct from the extension of the. I mean, it sounds like almost a very similar kind of argument that Descartes is making, but more emphatically, maybe I think, therefore I am, and he's saying that. And here he's the intelligible part. Plato's saying the intelligible is the being, is what it is, and everything else that is perceived by the senses is copies of the mind, and it's changing, and you can't it's not something that you can really rely on for what's real, right? So it's pretty interesting that this kind of it's a kind of the very similar theme that. But is he also making the distinction between the subject and object here also? The intelligible is a subject, right? And the things in the world that are perceived are objects.
Well, you raise a good question. I think I take the subject to be the cause, and the object is that which is seen or observed. So the subject is kind of the observer, and the object is the observed. And in here, he's saying that the sun is the force that allows the connection or the link between subject and object. And you raised the Descartes' idea. I think you were maybe talking about the duality of body and mind in Descartes. It kind of makes me wonder or think about Plato's idea of or Socrates' idea about the soul having three parts. The soul is the the thumos, or the spirit, or the drive, the appetites, which are like the desire, and then it's always governed by reason. And so maybe Descartes was more focused on the soul as kind of maybe two parts, divided between body and and mind. But I think maybe Socrates is adding this third element here, and he uses this simile or example of the sun as kind of the third element that connects, or that allows that connection between cause and effect, allows us to see and to be seen. And I think that's what he's trying to do here with this section.
Of course,
sorry.
Of course, Descartes eventually, right, posits a God that unites the duality of the mind and the body, right? So is Descartes' God, analogous to the sun here in Plato?
That's a fascinating question, actually. And as you say that, I'm just looking for the section here. I think Socrates actually says that the sun is the god. And I'm looking for that section. I'll find that section because I think you actually just raise a very important connection there, a very important link. If I play on the words here that Socrates has used, I notice that Socrates here, by the way, in the part that I'm highlighting, where he responds to Glaucon, he says, "I mean what you call light." So I wonder what Socrates calls light. He says what Glaucon calls light. It's not necessarily what Socrates calls light. So anyway, it's an interesting idea. So I'll look for that section. Thank you for raising that. But we'll go to Joel, who has his hand up. Joel?
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to focus a little bit on this idea of causality, because my take on this, or my understanding, which I always freely admit may be totally mistaken, is that what goes on in the mind is an attempt to mediate and provide a structure for what is absorbed by the senses. And that may be too abstract, so let me see if I can fill this in with a practical example. And I'll use the medical world, and I'll use a particular malady which I understand prior to COVID anyway was the most frequent cause of hospital admissions worldwide, and has been known of since the time of the Greeks. And that's called kidney stones. So there is a phenomenon where small stone particles are formed in the kidneys, and they're excruciatingly painful if they move from the kidneys and try to be expelled through the urine into the body. And I had one of those. In fact, I had multiple ones. And at the time that I had them, which is probably a half a century ago, the state of scientific knowledge was that they would examine the stones that were expelled from the body in a laboratory. Remember, this is a phenomenon that's been going on for 2,000 years and very well known, and occurs with great frequency even now in modern times. And they determined that they were primarily composed of calcium, so that the traditional diagnosis from the doctors was to restrict your intake of calcium. Don't drink milk, you don't have cheese. And, of course, I followed that regimen. And I had multiple occurrences over the years. After about 30 years of treatment, the medical facility discovered that people who had been given this diagnosis would have weakened bones. And it was recommended that they would have another form of medical test called a DEXA scan to test their bones. And sure enough, in many cases, their bones were weakened. and other medications would be prescribed to correct that if possible. Well, as it turns out, only in recent years, perhaps in the last 20 years, did they discover that the process that went on in the mind to interpret the kidney stones was completely wrong. And it was not a shortage of calcium, a surplus of calcium in the diet, but a shortage that caused the kidney stones, because the mechanism that formed the kidney stones was a different kind of substance which needed calcium to be expunged from the body. I think it's called oxalic acid. So the medical profession decided that they would then start a 180-degree reversal of their recommended treatment plan, and tell people to take calcium, which I have been on ever since, and thankfully it's been preventative and may have even helped my bones to recover to a certain extent. So these are referred to as iotropic diseases, or diseases caused by doctors or the medical profession, so that whatever happens outside, however the senses are combined to provide a causal explanation, isn't always correct. In the case of kidney stones, it took 2,000 years to discover that it was although intuitively it seemed sensible, was 180 degrees wrong. So what that does to our discussion, I'm not sure, but there are always conditions of less than virtual certainty when we're dealing with causality.
Interesting comment that you make, in an example that you use, Joel, in terms of that idea between cause, or that connection between cause and effect, and that idea of ordering of those connections, which makes me think of what JK said earlier about the symbolic order and the way the mind works. In fact, there's some debate as to what the real purpose of the Republic is, and is it meant to be a commentary on political ordering, or is it meant to be kind of a psychological commentary? I'm really seeing the Republic as more of a psychological commentary on how people's minds work. And so the example that you used of going down a particular path, the mindset that people employed to understand kidney stones in your example wound up being quite the opposite of what it should have been. And so it's an interesting example of the ordering of cause and effect, which I think is so critical, especially as we get into this era of very powerful technology in which that ordering can have a significant effect on the way people behave. So thank you for that example. We will go to Jacob. Jacob, welcome to Plato's Pod, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's a connection between, I know there's a connection between politics and healthy mind. So maybe that's where he's coming from. Like, we have to have a healthy mind in order to have a healthy government. So, because the government is made up of people. And if the people are corrupted, if the people do not see clearly, if they lack lucidity, then that will be reflected in the way the government is managed. And we see that today, where we have people who are in seats of public service here in the United States and are totally corrupted, confused, living in fear. And that's the government we have now. And the way it's functioning with all its wars and killing and neglect of the people is reflecting that. So, yeah, he's saying that we have to have a free mind. The mind must be liberated, come out of the matrix, And the matrix is the world of ideas, beliefs, stories, experiences, all of which are illusionary because they were put together by the previous programming, previous experiences, knowledge, which is limited. So the limited is reshaping the limited. You're never with the whole. You never see the truth. The truth is the whole. And so we have to find a way to free the mind, to awaken the innate capacity that we all have for wisdom. Right now, thought has taken over, thinking has taken over, and we have not awakened the capacity of wisdom. There's two intelligence: the intelligence of thinking, the intelligence of memory, passive memory, and the intelligence of wisdom, which doesn't originate in the brain. It has nothing to do with the material process of the brain, has nothing to do with memory, has nothing to do with knowledge. And the children are ready at the earliest age to be set free. So the only question is, how does this take place, within a person?
Well, you make a fascinating point there, Jacob, and thank you for that. Use the analogy of the Matrix. I assume you were referring to the movie,
Yes.
which I think is
well, it's not just the movie, but
yeah.
it's also the word matrix,
Right.
matrix.
Right.
Ma is mother, material, body. Thought is a material process of the brain. And so tricks. So it's the matrix. It's the tricks of the tricks of thought. Thought is tricking you all the time. Like right now, you think you're seeing me. You're not seeing me. You're seeing you. You're seeing your version of me, which is you. When you look at the tree, when you look at the cloud, when you look at your children, you're trapped in the matrix. That is the matrix. It's your own virtual reality bubble making machinery, which is the result of the listener, the thinker, the experiencer, the chooser, the critic, which is the me, which is a bundle of memory, active memory, actually. Active memory, it's acting as the interpreter, the experiencer, the chooser, etc. So it's the bundle of all your ideas, your beliefs, your concept, your identifications with this group, that group, your entire identity. It's not just one fragment of the me, it's the entire structure, which now is listening, interpreting, taking my words, evaluating them, analyzing them, comparing them with other knowledge that you have, and then recording them, making them into ideas or beliefs or concepts or points of view. And all that while, that means listening is not taking place. Listening is on another level. It has nothing to do with the intellect.
Well,
so experiencing is not taking place.
Yeah.
You're just collecting experiences, and each experience is shaped by the previous experiences you've had,
right,
which is limited. So this is what's going on, and we have to become aware of what is happening to the mind, to the brain, actually. And we must free the brain from, this process.
Let's explore that, Jacob. I'd like to, I'd like to get some thoughts of others on that, because I think what you talk about does relate to what Socrates says about the divided line. So I think I'd like to move to the divided line in about 2 minutes, but keep in mind that idea that you raised of the freedom of the mind, because I think the divided line talks about the use of reason as a way that we can free the mind. That the mind is not trapped to these visible images, and is not trapped only in the intelligible realm, but it's somehow that which combines both the visible and the intelligible realm that really maybe frees the mind. And I like the way that you put that. You also talked about the innate capacity for wisdom, which I think relates to, if I remember, it was Nari who mentioned earlier that idea of, if a child is born and is really not given any education, what would happen to that child? And I think maybe there's been some examples of such studies that have happened in the past. And so maybe we keep that in mind. I just wanted to go here to this section that I've got on the screen, which continues the simile of the sun. So this is 508b to 509b. And I'll just read 3 paragraphs here, starting with Socrates saying, "You know that when we turn our eyes to things whose colors are no longer illuminated by the light of day, but by night lights, the eyes are dimmed and seem nearly blind, as if clear vision were no longer in them. Yet whenever one turns them on things illuminated by the sun, they see clearly, and vision appears in those very same eyes." Glaucon says, "Indeed. So Socrates continues, well, understand the soul in the same way. When it focuses on something illuminated by truth and what is, it understands, knows, and apparently possesses understanding. But when it focuses on what is mixed with obscurity and what comes to be and passes away, it opines and is dimmed, changes its opinions this way and that, and seems bereft of understanding. Glaucon confirms it does seem that way. And Socrates goes on here, and this is a part that we could spend a little bit of time on, although we're running a little bit short. We've got about 20 minutes left. Socrates says, so that what gives truth to the things known and the power to know to the knower is the form of the good. So here he's talking about the good, and here he's telling us what the form of the good is. And then he says, and though it is the cause of knowledge and truth, it is also an object of knowledge. Both knowledge and truth are beautiful things, but the good is other and more beautiful than they. In the visible realm, light and sight are rightly considered sun-like, but it is wrong to think that they are the sun. So here it is right to think of knowledge and truth as good-like, but wrong to think that either of them is the good, for the good is yet more prized. Glaucon concludes by saying this is an inconceivably beautiful thing you're talking about if it provides both knowledge and truth and is superior to them in beauty. So Glaucon is saying that there's three things that come out of this conclusion. And very interested to see what people think about this idea that Socrates says, so that what gives truth to the things known and the power to know to the knower is the form of the good. So gives truth to the things known. So the objects that we know are true, but it also gives the power to know. And so just wondering what people think about this.
Can truth be known?
Can truth be known? Yeah. So we'll go to Moshe. Your thoughts on this, Moshe?
I just want to go to the line before. And though it is the cause of knowledge and truth, it is also an object of knowledge. Mm-hmm. So is that the same thing as saying that the good is both, is at the same time the cause and the effect? In other words, the good is its own cause, or as we used to say in the study of religion, that it's sui generis.
Yeah, that is, so the question you raise, I think, is the key to this. And that's the way I read this, that the good is both the cause and the effect.
Well, that certainly violates any sort of scientific, I'll use that term loosely, or the way someone like a later scientist, let's say in the 1800s or 1900s or 20th century, would think about cause and effect. They're distinct things. Without relying too much on Hume, Hume tells us that we can separate cause and effect in the imagination, and because all images come from impressions, and there are no images without impressions, that would mean that the impression of the cause and the impression of the effect can be separate. It follows from that they can't be the same. So I find this very mystical, and it just goes beyond what in the Western tradition we think of cause and effect.
I think it's a valid point that you raise, and it certainly does seem to go against intuition, because I think we all have this sense that there is an order of things, and cause and effect can't be the same thing at the same time. I think that's what you're saying, and certainly that seems to be a natural intuition. I'm wondering, though, as the knowledge of science, and particularly the science of the quantum realm, is growing, we know that there is in the quantum realm this effective superposition in which cause and effect are in fact superopposed, and they are instantaneous and simultaneous. And so that's maybe one thought that we could explore. So I appreciate your raising that, because I think it is certainly a point that many could see and object to with this. So we'll go to JK and then to Eva. JK?
Well, according to science, the scientific understanding of cause and effect, science is only taking a segment of that chain of cause and effect, right? And you mentioned the quantum realm. even though we're, indulging in the understanding of that quantum realm, we haven't gotten to the ultimate cause, right? The ultimate cause, is it string theory, or is it is some other material element, right? But if you think of the cause and effect within a chain, inside this chain of cause and effect, what is the ultimate cause? Well, if the ultimate cause would have to be also an effect, wouldn't it? Isn't that Spinoza's argument that the ultimate cause is a substance that it's its own, that it causes itself, and its effect is also, a cause, right? So it's kind of so I think that's what he means. So the ultimate good is a cause of itself, isn't it? So the effect is also its cause, unless you only see the good as part of the only one segment of that chain.
Well, thank you for raising Spinoza. Spinoza is a philosopher I would like to spend more time with, so I will endeavor to do that. I think, as you mentioned, can the ultimate would the ultimate cause also be an effect? That's an interesting idea, and I don't have any views on that, but I'm wondering what others think about that. You did use the term chain in what you just said, and that makes me think again about what Socrates said about sun being a link. Just thinking about words, chains having links, and the sun maybe providing that link in that particular simile that Socrates used. So we've got some interesting ideas here. Can cause and effect be simultaneous? Moshe, I think, raised the natural intuition that they can't. JK, you've talked about the ultimate cause maybe also being an effect. And so I'm wondering what others think. We'll go to Eva and then to Moshe.
Yeah, thank you, James. Great discussion, everyone. I would like to wonder with you all now, what if we thought of the knowledge as a process, and a process of becoming in scientific way and in philosophical way, considering we are born as something and we change the structure, and when it's a human being, we call it like growing. We are not trying to stop at a place. We say growing or we say maturing. I am wondering, doesn't society mature or grow or change? So if that's happening, what if we took the knowledge or even scientific data as growing process? So then nothing we know is super accurate. And then can we become more flexible with what we know? I just wanted to wander on this with you now. Thank you.
That's an interesting idea, that idea of flexibility that you use there, Eva. And also, your reference to knowledge being used in a process of becoming, which again takes me back to Timaeus 28a, which is, that distinction that Socrates made between that which always is and never becomes, and that which is always becoming but never is. We, being our bodies being physical objects, inhabit that second realm, the realm of that which always becomes but never is. Whereas the forms, Plato's forms, would be in the realm of that which always is but never becomes. So we've got this mixture of two different realms, and so we're in the physical realm that is always changing, and is knowledge the key to understanding that process of change and the order in which that change occurs. So thank you for that. And we'll go back to Moshe.
Eva, I want to give you intellectual comfort. I know that I'm sitting in a chair. I am very confident that you know that you are also sitting in a chair. And I know that 2 + 2 = 4. And so you know that as well. So there are things that can be known. but that's just aside to make you feel more comfortable. I want to go back to what J.K. was saying about Spinoza. Spinoza, although he refers to substance as God, he also refers to nature as substance. And he says that substance can be has many different attributes, infinite attributes, but we can conceive them under the attribute of extension and under the attribute of thought and under the attributes of either any attributes has infinite number of modes, so that we under the substance conceived under the attribute of thought there can be infinite individual thoughts, and the same thing with substance, the modes of substance conceived as extension. There can be infinite extended things. In terms of cause and effect, there is no in Spinoza there is no ultimate cause. There is just the laws of causation that have gone on forever and will continue to go on forever. So just as a scholastic point, I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you for that, Moshe. Maybe just we've got about just 10 minutes remaining. And so I thought what I would do here is just move relatively quickly, unfortunately, but we can introduce this idea of the divided line. And this is maybe where we can start to reconcile some of these notions that we have about knowledge and how to understand the truth of what we are seeing, either with the eyes or with the mind. So in this section from 509D to 511B, Socrates is suggesting that we need to kind of use the analogy of a line and divide this line in two unequal sections. And the word unequal here I've underlined on what you're seeing in the screen, just because that gives rise to the need for ratio. So Socrates says it is like a line divided into two unequal sections. Then divide each section, namely that of the visible and of the intelligible, in the same ratio as a line. Then he talks about the relative clarity and opacity of those sections of the line. One subsection of the visible consists of images. So here we're on the visible part of the line that includes those images, such as the images that the prisoner in the cave saw. And he says, by the images, I mean first shadows, like what the prisoner was seeing on the wall, then reflections in water and in all close-packed, smooth and shiny materials and everything of that sort, if you understand. In the other subsection of the visible, put the originals of those images, namely the animals around us, all the plants, and the whole class of manufactured things. And so then he talks about the use of opinion with those and, the connection of opinion to knowledge. So in terms of the visible things, are we able to connect the images of what we see with the actual thing itself? He goes on then to talk about the part of the line that deals with the intelligible realm. So this is the realm that we cannot see, such as the realm of knowledge. I mean, knowledge itself cannot be seen. We can see things that we know or we think we know, but we can't see knowledge itself. So this line is divided between the visible things and the intelligible things. So this second part, he talks about the intelligible things, and he says, consider now how the section of the intelligible is to be divided. And this is what I find really interesting. He says, in one subsection, the soul, using as images the things that were imitated before, is forced to investigate from hypotheses, proceeding not to a first principle, but to a conclusion. So we start with hypotheses, we move to conclusion. We don't know what the first principle is at this point. He says, in the other subsection, however, it makes its way to a first principle that is not a hypothesis, proceeding from a hypothesis, but without the images used in the previous subsection, using forms themselves and making its investigation through them. So we're not making reference here to the visible images, because that's in the visible part of the line. Here we're just making reference to a first principle from a hypothesis. So he's kind of suggesting that in the mind, I think, and I'm interested to see how others read this, suggesting in the mind that we use two forms of confirming the validity of things. We go from hypothesis to conclusions, And then we go from hypothesis to first principle. And then we kind of compare those processes in a form of dialectic, which is where we kind of combine the arguments and reconcile them and see if in the intersection of those arguments we reach some sort of agreement. And I think this is a very important part of what he's talking about in terms of testing our knowledge. And I'm wondering what others think about this. I'll throw it over to JK. Your thoughts, JK?
It sounds like he's he's doing what the empiricists were doing, vis-a-vis, and then the rationalists. So he's like the first hypothesis, is proceeding, to first principles into a conclusion. It sounds like the inductive logic, inductive reasoning, right? And he's building hypotheses based on empirical experience. And then the second part is you begin with first principles that are not hypotheses. Isn't that deductive logic then? He's come up with these categories, a priori categories of understanding, a priori and a posteriori and so forth, and trying to bring them together to into this kind of interaction or dialectic to come to some kind of a understanding of what what is truth. It sounds like precursor of Kantian, the Kantian philosophy of the first critique, right?
That's fascinating. I really like the way that you use both the inductive and deductive approaches to logic, and then comparing them so that you're not relying on either one or the other. So that in your reasoning, which is kind of part of the three-part soul that Socrates continually presents here and elsewhere, the faculty of reason is what brings these two lines of reasoning together, these two lines of logic, the deductive line and the inductive line. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it. And certainly, I think, as you said, it has had an influence on future or subsequent philosophers such as Kant. I'm wondering, does anybody else have any ideas or thoughts about this section? Is this particular approach helpful to making sense of these images that we see and making sense of what's in the intelligible realm? Moshe?
I want to make the distinction between knowing what Plato said and having a clear understanding of his theory of the divided line, which I take as something that you could ask any undergraduate in a class to tell you what the divided line was, and he should or she should be able to trot it out. I want to distinguish that from some of the language that is used in this section to describe what's going on, because for emphasis, you've underlined from hypothesis to conclusion, and at least for me, I don't think of a hypothesis. I just want to point out, I have a hypothesis that the dent in the car door was caused by a collision with another automobile. Okay, and when I verified that indeed another automobile hit the door and caused it to crush in like that, that's a conclusion. But what it really does is it validates the hypothesis, and hypotheses are things whose conclusions can either validate them or falsify them. For instance, going back to my idea of, the dent in the car was caused by a collision with another car, that could be, that hypothesis could be falsified. That would be the conclusion if the car, in fact, wasn't hit by another car, but was hit by a large stone falling off a mountain as I drove by. So I think that we have to be careful with our idea of a conclusion, that it's going to lead us to a true hypothesis only, because a conclusion can also lead us to the falsification of the hypothesis. And so it doesn't follow from that if we have this infinite chain, or let's say a finite chain, we come up of hypotheses and conclusions, that we come up with a first principle. We might not. Okay, everyone wants to go along and say, oh, hypothesis, conclusion, we find a first principle. No, it could be hypothesis and the conclusion invalidates the hypothesis. And so we don't come to a first principle at all. So I just want to point out that analytically, I also want to separate that from, what the canonical understanding of, Plato's divided line is.
And I think, yes, we appreciate that, and you pointed out a good point. I think that the conclusion can be something that is, in fact, that the hypothesis was falsified, and I think that's a good point to understand. And I think here he's saying that it's a two-part process. We go from hypothesis to conclusion using the images that we've retained in our memory. But then without using those images, we do a second process, which is going from hypothesis to a first principle using only the forms and not the images. And I think it's what he's trying to say is that in the comparison of those two processes, in the reconciliation of those two processes, we would find either the truth of what we thought in the hypothesis or the falsification of what we thought in the hypothesis. But either way, we would wind up at a true representation of reality. So thank you for raising that idea of falsification. I think that's quite important here to understand. It's not explicit in this particular section, but I think it's important to understand. We just have, we're actually running short on time. So if we can go a few minutes over the scheduled ending time, if everybody could bear with us, that would be great. And we'll end maybe at 12:05. I've got Joel, though, with his hand up. So we'll take Joel, and any final thoughts we can have before we end the recording. And then after we end the recording, as I said earlier, those who want to stay online for Plato's Cafe, just a casual discussion unrecorded, are welcome to do so. So we'll go to Joel.
Hey guys, can you hear me properly?
Yes, we can.
Well, first of all, hi everybody. I hope everyone had a great summer. It's awesome to see everyone. So sorry I came in late. But what caught my ear a few minutes earlier was this talk about first causes. So I would actually just like to come in with my hands up and ask everybody for some quick clarification, because this was actually jumping around my mind earlier this summer, and I was hoping if anybody can help me, if I can. I saw two correlations here about whether the idea of a first cause is valid. So coming up with, Einstein's famous equation of E equals mc squared, which is basically the equivalent of saying energy and mass are interchangeable, and they are different forms of the same thing. And if you were able to combine that first observation with the law of conservation of energy, that is to say, energy cannot be created nor destroyed, is it, if you combine those two formulas, is that essentially saying that matter is a form of energy and energy is eternal to a degree? It's infinite. There is no first cause. It could be like, if you break it down all the way down to quantum mechanics, and then things like string theory is coming out onto the forefront. Like, are those correlated, or am I out in left field trying to mix those together?
Thank you, Joel, for that interesting question. I think you've asked a question about physics, and certainly, or at least as Einstein defined physics as the equivalence of energy and mass at the speed of light squared, and there can be this conversion from one to the other. And I think you raise a really interesting question: was there a first cause of energy? And I think, if I understand the question, that relates really maybe to this idea of the Big Bang. Which is held to be the idea that, everything started in this big explosion, 13.8 billion years ago. But then that raises the question of, well, what caused the Big Bang? And so maybe we'll let JK have the last word on that question.
Yeah, Einstein was very enamored by Spinoza, he wrote a long, quite a long love letter to Spinoza, elevating his philosophy to that of a very true understanding of the first cause. I think so. He might have been equating thinking about energy as maybe the ultimate substance. I'm not sure, but that's an interesting, question you raised there. But science today, are in the book by Stephen Hawking, he's saying that if we can understand that through the theory of everything, all these different, all the 4 or 5 different causes, then we would understand what God is.
Interesting connection between Einstein and Spinoza there. I had forgotten about that. And I think we'll probably get more into the first cause when we start talking about Parmenides later this season. But I see, Jacob, your hand up. So we just have literally a minute left, Jacob, if you'd like to throw in a last thought there.
Right. It's amazing that, I got through just pointing out the fact that, that reason is limited, right? And then after I'm done, you continue going on with reasoning. Reasoning is limited. It can never get to the truth, right? Just see that simple fact. It's a fact. It's not an idea. It's not a theory. It's not a belief. It's an actual fact, right? So what happens when you see that fact, right? Won't you stop? And in the stopping, something else takes place. And you never get there. You're never there. And only that attention, I call it total attention, only total attention can see the truth, which will set you free from the me, the thinker, which is an illusion. Thought made it up because the organism was seeking security. It was seeking permanency. It gained great comfort in the idea, the notion of a me that will continue. And it thought that it would provide security, when in fact, we have thousands of years of history to see what life with the me is like, with all its divisions and brutality and war and mental afflictions and everything. And we never go, well, what would life be without the me, right? And is there a me? Is there actually a me? I think we're under 2 delusions, that there is a me, right? And that we cannot live without it. And those 2 delusions hold us to the thinker, the experiencer, which is acting as a filter, which prevents us from seeing things as they are. We see things as we are. We never see anything. We only see ourselves, like John Malkovich going down his own portal. That is your whole life from the cradle to the grave. But the good news is that it's not inevitable. It's not hardwired. It's not that it must be this way and that there's no other way to be. And the children are ready to be set free. It's our natural state. The fact is, we're already there. There's nothing to do, right? But we're under these delusions, right? And that's what holds us, And from the delusions, we see the world. From our delusions, a mind that is crippled. And then we're thinking, oh, I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to figure it out. No, you're sick. The mind is crippled by delusions, illusions, hallucinations, mirages, which are your beliefs, your ideas. All ideas are abstractions. They're not what's actually taking place now. And you're with your ideas and notions and interpretations rather than the actual. So
thank you for that,
yeah.
Jacob. I think this idea that reason is not
Limited.
necessarily going to lead to a finite position. I think that's an important point that you're making, and it is potentially infinite in its ability to regress. So
it has a place in function, though, like language. Right now, I'm using language. That's reason. That's thought. Right. So it has a place.
Yeah. Well, let's just go to JK, and literally we should end this in about 2 minutes. But JK, your thoughts?
Yeah, just like in Buddhist enlightenment, there are 2 paths. One is the gradual, and the other one is sudden enlightenment. And they both have something to commend. Maybe it's depends on the person, And so some people need to traverse the fantasy, and in order to get there. And and reason is one of those fantasies. And that's the only path that a reasonable person can know to lead to his destination, right? And other people take drugs, other people meditate, other people sit in a room by themselves and just contemplate. And so there are different paths, I think, to enlightenment.
There's no path.
Interesting idea, JK. That
Path is time.
You brought in, JK, that idea of Buddhism.
Time is the enemy.
That's a path. That's a path.
No, don't make it into a path. Your mind, right? Heard my thing, translated it into an idea, right? Made it into a path, right? Your mind did that. I made a verbal statement, right? The verbal statement is not the thing itself. It's pointing to something. The words are pointing. Now you're with the words, making it into an idea. Now you're lost.
Yeah. Well, Jacob, I'm afraid we'll have to wind up at this point, Jacob. We will have the opportunity to return to this discussion, though. I think it's a very important one. I think it will kind of permeate our discussions on the Republic. And so I thank everybody for participating today. And just remind everybody again that our next session will be in 3 weeks, not 2. And the passages that we'll look at in that section in the Republic are 368a to 376c. I'll get the posting up on meetup.com shortly. And I hope everybody will be available to return with us at that point, and look forward to that discussion. We can certainly, as I said, continue this kind of conception of knowledge that we have been working on today, and really understanding how it applies as we go forward in the Republic and the other dialogues that we'll look at this season. So again, thank you everybody for participating in such a great discussion today. So many good ideas. I've been making notes all the way along and looking forward to listening to the recording, which will get up on various podcasting platforms, likely within the next week or so. And looking forward to seeing everybody in 3 weeks. Those who wish, I'll stop the recording in a moment. Those who wish to stay online, please do so. Feel free to do so, and we'll continue until about 12:30 Eastern time here if anybody wants to chat just about what we talked about today, or just philosophy in general. So thank you all again, and we'll hope to see you in 3 weeks.